Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for our Coffee with Curators, Textile Tuesday at 8. I'm Diana Bell-Kite, and I'm here today with RaeLana Poteat, and we are both curators at the museum, and we're the minds behind Textile Tuesday. I curate the flat textile collection, and RaeLana curates the clothing collection. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and then give you a little introduction to what we're going to talk about. All right. If you have followed the museum social media for long, you have seen our weekly post, and if not, you should. But to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about, Textile Tuesday appears each week on Facebook and Instagram and features a photograph of a textile object from our collection, along with a short one-paragraph discussion of its history, maker, materials, and any information that we have about it. I started Textile Tuesday 8 years ago this month with our then social media manager, Trisha Blackstone. At that time, she was hoping to use social media, which was fairly new for the museum at that period, as a way to highlight our artifact collections. And like most museums, only about 10% of our collections are on display at any one time, with the rest in storage. And so social media provided a great way for us to make those objects more accessible to the wider public. And over the past 8 years, we've shared photos and stories of over 400 textile objects from our collections, from quilts to tablecloths to wedding gowns to Christmas tree ornaments. And we've had a lot of fun exploring the depth of our collection and presenting the stories of little known North Carolinians, primarily women who made and used these objects, and presenting those to a wider audience. So for the next 20 minutes or so, we'd like to revisit some of our favorite posts from the past 8 years. And in so doing, give you a snapshot of our amazing textile collection. And I also want to give a shout out to our two museum photographers, Eric Blevins and Kent Thompson, who took all of the beautiful pictures you'll see of the objects in our collections. All right, I want to start with this quilt, which was our first ever Textile Tuesday post. And this was posted on April 2nd, 2013. And this is a beautifully made quilt and also one that's very indicative of North Carolina quilting in the late 19th century. We don't know a lot about the maker of this quilt. According to donor information, it's possibly Annie Elizabeth Bass Knight Sproul of Terrell County. And this quilt came from a larger collection of items associated with the Bass Knight and Sproul families. One surprising thing about the quilt is that it's pieced rather than appliqued. And for any, excuse me, any of you who are quilters, you know that piecing is when you attach fabric pieces side to side, and applique is when you affix one cloth piece on top of another to make the pattern. Often when a quilter is making a pattern with a lot of curves, applique is easier. However, applique also uses more fabric. And the maker of this quilt economized fabric by piecing, which would have been pretty difficult to get all of those curving tulip petals and stems just right. And you can see that the quilting, or the stitches that join the layers of the quilt together, is very dense and carefully done. The pattern and colors of this quilt are very indicative of late 19th century North Carolina quilts. The triple sashing, which are the borders between the tulip blocks, is very prevalent regionally during this period. Also, the teal and oxblood colors that you see on the quilt top here were popular in the late 1800s, when the new textile mills that blossomed after the Civil War were able to produce brightly colored cloth cheaply, owing in part to new chemical dyes that were developed in the mid-19th century and beyond. The tulip pattern was also very popular in this time and place. So taken all together, this is an extremely well-made quilt that speaks to a particular time and place in North Carolina history. I'm now going to hand it over to Rae to share one of her favorite objects.
Thank you, Diana. Can you advance the slide to the next one? So one of my research loves, I know Diana said that I do the clothing, but one of my research loves are samplers. And so I wanted to make sure that we got a sampler into this presentation as well. And this is a beautiful example from our collection. Jane Celinda Adams made this in 1835 at the Bethany Female School. It's very unusual that you can see that stitched on the sampler. For North Carolina, it is not that common to know which school that these samplers were made at. You can see the sets of initials down along the bottom. Those are the initials of her parents and her siblings. The sampler is also very unusual in that it has paper stitched to the back to it, and that's why we're showing you the front and the back here. The paper are 3 sets of period poems that Jane's sister Margaret copied out. We don't know, you can see actually her initials down right-hand side at the bottom of the verse, the MCA that's done in blue, those are Margaret's initials. We don't know whether Jane stitched the poems onto the back. Her sister died young. We don't know, or fairly young. We don't know if she put them on or if someone else in the family stitched them on as a memory piece. Basically, both of these women died fairly young. Jane died at 28 and Margaret died at probably around 33. And so this descended in their families. We don't know whether the families put it together to make this memory piece or whether Jane did it when her sister died about a year before she did. One of the things that I noticed when I was looking back, trying to choose just one sampler to highlight, is that a lot of our samplers tend to be a lovely physical object that brings us back to the story of the people who made it. Same thing can be said for quilts or other objects in our collection. For women who tend to be forgotten in the historical record or don't show up as much in the written historical record, these objects can be one of the best ways we have of going back and finding their stories. So having an object like this leads us to research the women to find out as much as we can about them. And in this particular case, both Jane and Margaret died before 1850. So their names never show up in the census. Women's names, unless you were head of household, don't show up until 1850. So this piece is a great way that their family has been able to preserve their memory and to send us as historians back to discover that story. Okay.
Okay. All right. One unexpected benefit of Textile Tuesday has been the way in which it has allowed us to connect with people across the state and across the country. And this next item was posted in the summer of 2014, and it's a formal gown made by esteemed Raleigh designer Willie Odie Kay. Kay was a Raleigh institution. She was a Black woman who designed wedding, debutante, and special occasion gowns for a biracial clientele for some 60 years during the Jim Crow era and beyond. And still today, so many North Carolinians remember Willie Kay fondly due to her exquisite designs, her professionalism, and her family's involvement in the civil rights movement. When we posted this photo, we got an overwhelming response of interest with people sharing their memories of Willie Kay, offering to show us their dresses that they had that she had made, and showing photographs of their debuts, weddings, and parties. And due in part to this outpouring of interest on social media, the museum decided to present an exhibit of Willie Odie Kay's and her sisters, who were also designers, work in 2016. And we have a sizable collection of Kay's designs, but due to our community connections made in part through Textile Tuesday, we were able to add a series of temporary rotations of loaned dresses to the exhibit as well. And so it was truly a community undertaking, and social media was a big part of that.
So I know all of you are probably going, this is not a textile, but we do highlight on Textile Tuesday items that may not actually be textiles, but help tell the story of textiles in our collection or textiles in general. And this is one of those. This is a photograph, and it's very unique. This is one of my favorite things in our collection, even though it's just a small photograph, because it shows a unidentified Raleigh girl wearing a dress made of newsprint. So if you can tell, if you look closely at her skirt, it is made from newspaper. We don't know if it's stitched to fabric or if it's literally just made from the newspaper with the fabric down along the hem. The rest of her outfit does appear to be fabric, but the skirt is from a paper. Luckily, she's wearing the big banner that says Chronicle. It says Chronicle down at the bottom. It says Chronicle on her hat. So we were able to guess that this newspaper is probably the Chronicle. So the State Chronicle was a paper that was in print in Raleigh from 1883 to 1893. And by doing a lot of close zooming on this photograph and comparing to other newspapers from the period and looking at where the articles were and where the ads were placed and everything, we were able to determine the exact issue that is used in the skirt. So this skirt was made from the May 14th, 1892 issue of the State Chronicle. And by doing a little further research, we were able to find out that in 1892, the Chronicle switched from using newsboys to newsgirls. So that gives us a little bit of an explanation of what this photo might be. Another paper at the time had an article that said that 40 girls applied for the positions, and it is alleged that the girls are more prompt and careful. Now, what we don't know is how this outfit was used. We suspect that it was more of a promotional outfit. We don't have any kind of period descriptions anywhere of girls wearing outfits like this to sell papers or deliver papers. So we think it was more just a promotion. But it does come from a photo album that is in our collection, and you can see that down in the corner. The album was owned by a woman named Eliza Poole. She was a longtime Raleigh teacher. She taught and was principal in Raleigh schools for more than 50 years. And this photo album came to us from the family that she lived with. Longtime Raleigh residents may be familiar with the Briggs hardware. She lived with the Briggs family, and they donated some of her items after she passed away, including this book. We don't know whether this girl was a student of hers, but there are other photos in the album that indicate that they were her students. So that might be why she had this image. And also for longtime Raleigh people, you might be familiar with Eliza Poole Park, which is sort of south of the city. That is also named after this teacher. And so I just love this one because it's got so many different layers to it, and it's such an interesting take on clothing.
Okay. All right. The museum has a large collection of doilies from the 19th and 20th centuries. And this is one of my favorites in our collection. And the maker of this doily was Maria Salas of Mebane in Alamance County. And she was born in the state of Nayarit, Mexico. And she moved to North Carolina in 1982 and brought with her her tradition of making crochet doilies or carpetas. And she learned to crochet from her teacher's wife when she was 10 years old. And in her family and community, it was expected for women to know how to crochet and to make doilies to beautify their home before they were married, and to make a set of doilies to bring into their marriage with them. And often she, her mother, and her mother-in-law would trade patterns or copy each other's patterns when they saw a design that they particularly liked. And family in Mexico would send her the yarn that she needed to make her carpetas or doilies, as she found it difficult to find the kind that she was used to using here in North Carolina in the mid-1980s. And Maria Salas believed that carpetas made a home much more beautiful. And so she put doilies under all of her family photos. She put them on top of electronics that she deemed unsightly, like the television and the VCR. And she even had a large doily that she would use to cover her sewing machine when she wasn't using it to make that prettier as well. So I just love how this doily tells a story of a newer North Carolinian who brought a tradition, a textile tradition with her from her home country of Mexico.
Here we have one of the lovely gowns in our collection. I did want to show you some of our really pretty objects as one of our choices. This was worn by a member of the Andrews family of Raleigh, and we know due to an interior tag that it was made by Cincinnati dressmaker Anna Dunleavy, probably sometime around 1903 to 1905. It is made from hand-painted silk. So all of the little tiny sprigs of pink flowers that you can see on there, and there's little tiny dots, it's all painted on the fabric. A very beautiful, intricate piece. And it was common at the time for women from Raleigh or from North Carolina, wealthy women, to travel to other larger cities like Cincinnati or Baltimore or New York to visit a high-end dressmaker to have a piece like this made, or several pieces like this made. We used this piece when it was originally posted in 2015 to 2015. I'm not sure I have the right date on that. We used this piece probably after 2017 because it was photographed for the Shape of Fashion. So it is an exhibit that we were focusing on a lot of different fashion looks in, and the post for this one emphasized that this was a pigeon breast look or a puffed front look. And this is a look that was very popular at the turn of the century, around 1900. Had a special new corset that helped women achieve this look. And what it did was sort of thrust the bust forward and the hips and the shoulders back and create an S curve. So sometimes you'll hear it called as a pigeon front because a lot of times the blouse is poofed out sort of like a pigeon breast, or an S curve look. And so I was able to use the photography that our wonderful photographers did for that exhibit. We have lots of different items of clothing that were shot for that, to use those as our Textile Tuesdays and to make the content of those posts about how fashion changes over time, what some of the different looks over time are. And this is just a wonderful, beautiful example of that turn of the century pigeon front or S-shaped look.
All right. This next piece comes from Duplin County. Woven coverlets were fairly common as bedspreads during the antebellum period. Farm families often had looms, which they could use to weave household textiles. Whereas quilts during this period were often made of more expensive purchased fabric. So Mary J. Fussell of Duplin County made this coverlet in 1843. And according to her granddaughter, to whom Mary had recounted the story, the coverlet was handmade from start to finish. The granddaughter wrote in 1954, quote, "The material from which this spread is made, both cotton and indigo for dye, was planted and cultivated by Mrs. John G. Fussell, Duplin County, NC, in 1843. Was picked and ginned by hand, carded with handmade cards, spun on a handmade wheel, and wove in a handmade loom, laid off and worked by her hands only. It is very much prized and owned by her granddaughter in Virginia." When we're researching these items, we do a lot of genealogy and compare public records like census and marriage data to the information that donors provide to see if it matches up. And in this case, this story seems possible. In 1843, the Fussells had been married for a few years and they had a one-year-old daughter. There don't appear to be any enslaved people in their household. Perhaps creating the coverlet was tied in some way to the birth of their daughter or as a way to mark their recent marriage. And it clearly did pass down through the family to their granddaughter, who then gave it to us.
So once again, this one is not a textile, but is about textiles. I'm sorry I couldn't help myself. I was trying to find a dress and I just kept coming back to this one. This is one of my favorites because it is just so random. It's also a great example of how we try and tie our Textile Tuesday posts to calendar dates when we can. So this was actually posted in March of 2016 to coincide with March being National Craft Month. And it is connected to the idea of home sewing, but the slightly lesser known type of home sewing in which you made outfits from bath and bed linens. So this is a pamphlet that we had in our collection. It is from the late 1960s, and it attempted to persuade consumers that Fieldcrest products were beautiful enough to wear. So the company created this line and had fashion shows where they were promoting fashions by Fieldcrest. They would go and have these shows across the country. They created patterns from them and they sold those patterns to the public. So if you look up on the sort of top center, we have a pantsuit That is actually a Vogue pattern, 7293 Vogue. It is made from 7 Polynesia bath towels. The one down in the bottom right corner is made from a bedspread. And if any of you out there recall what bedspreads were like in the late 60s or 70s, you can imagine how comfortable that sort of stiff polyester backed fabric would have been. I love this piece because it is such a great indicator of such a certain particular moment in time. And it's just really fun to look at. So we like choosing Textile Tuesdays that are going to appeal to people and make people go, oh, I remember that, or oh, can you imagine that? And this is one of those. The piece came into our collection as part of a larger group of clothing and patterns that were used by a Raleigh family, Frances Wagner and her mother, Lula Jordan of Raleigh. And they used the objects to create clothing for their family. Unfortunately, we did not receive any clothing made from towels or bedspreads with this collection. But if anybody has any out there, I would be interested in hearing about it.
Okay. As historians, our primary goal is to tell the stories and histories of people. And as museum curators, we frequently do this through material objects like the textiles we've shown you so far. Sometimes those objects are finely made out of expensive materials. Other times they are more utilitarian in nature and made to be used. And this is an example of one of those. This piece was made by a woman who was no stranger to hard work. Lela Sneed worked as a farm laborer and later as a domestic worker on the farm of a white couple in Franklin County. And she used the materials that she had available to make this extremely heavy, warm bed cover. She used feed sacks made from the cotton bags animal feed was sold in the late 19th through the mid 20th centuries to make this quilt, as well as denim from men's overalls, which were widely worn among farm workers. And she batted the quilt with cotton, likely grown on the farm where she worked. The quilt is stitched with tobacco twine, which was a type of inexpensive cotton thread used primarily for looping tobacco leaves to sticks for curing and curing barns, but also employed by thrifty seamstresses as well for a variety of purposes. Lela Sneed clearly believed in wasting nothing and in using what was available to make what she needed. And in that way, her quilt is a remarkable testament to one farm woman's frugality and ingenuity and to life in rural North Carolina in the mid 20th century more generally.
So we are back to another beautiful dress here. And this one I chose because it's a good example of how we like to tie our Textile Tuesdays when we can to dates that were important to the wearers or the makers of the objects. So this post ran in or on April 16th, 2019, which was the day after the 140th anniversary of the marriage between Hugh Morrison and Sally Todd Field. This was a couple that was from Virginia, but they spent their entire married life in Raleigh. Hugh Morrison, who you can see down there on the left, was a teacher and later principal of Raleigh's first high school for white students. And when that school was moved in the 1920s, it was actually renamed in his honor in 1924. So some people who have been around Raleigh for a long time might remember the Hugh Morrison High School, since been torn down, but it was named for him. The dress that is pictured is a lovely example of the period sort of in between the big bustle and the lower bustle and the big bustle. There were a few years in the late 1870s, early 1880s where the dress got really tight going down. And so this is a beautiful example of that, and all the bows and the ruffles and the ribbons that would go on those dresses. We don't know whether this was her wedding dress, but we know that it is from around the time of her wedding. And then we also happen to have the picture that you can see there of the couple in our collection as well. And she is wearing a dress from a similar time period in that. So either one of these could have been her wedding dresses. They are most likely from her wedding trousseau because of when they date to. And it's just a good example of how people tend to associate clothing with those important milestones in their lives. So we have a lot of items in our collection related to weddings or to christenings, to those big moments in people's lives, because people sort of connect the clothing they were wearing at that time, or they give it a special importance. It's saved in their families, passed down, and then eventually may become part of a museum collection where everyone can enjoy it. So these have been just some examples of some of our favorites. It was honestly very hard to choose and narrow down, but it's been fun for us going and looking back through all the things that we've posted. It's hard to believe it's been 8 years, but this has been a lot of fun for us as we go along. We are available now to answer any questions you might have about the particular pieces we've shown, or about Textile Tuesday posting in general, or curation of textile objects. I don't know, do we have any questions yet in the chat, or I can just randomly ask you questions if needed, Diana?
We don't have any yet, but anyone who has questions, please just type them in the chat and we will do our best.
So Diana, what is your favorite time period for quilts? I know you work a lot with quilts, but what would you say your favorite type of quilt is, or look for a quilt?
I'm really interested in utilitarian quilts that you start seeing after the Civil War, and you really start seeing sort of regional Southern designs becoming very distinct during that late 19th century period as well. And we've got a few questions in the chat. I'm new to the area. What is the oldest piece in the collection? I can tell you the oldest quilt in our collection. I'm not sure I can tell you the oldest piece in the entire collection. Our oldest quilt is from 1781, and it is a crib quilt made of silk.
And there would be a similar time period like that for our clothing. We have a few pieces from the 18th century, but because clothing, especially in the South, deteriorates so much or is reused, most of our 18th century pieces don't actually look quite right for 18th century anymore, because they were either fixed by later generations or reused as later pieces. But we do have a few from that early time period.
Okay, another question is Textile Tuesday on Facebook or Instagram? It is on both. So follow us both on Facebook and Instagram, but we do have differing content that appears on both platforms. So you'll probably want to follow both. Recent museum studies grad here. What sort of background got you into textile curation? You want to take that one?
Well, we don't do the conservation. We do have conservators here on staff. But as far as what got me into textiles is my thesis for undergrad was about women, professional women in North Carolina and Virginia. And a lot of those professional women tended to be school teachers who taught people how to make samplers or other needlework pieces. And so then that sort of led me to a master's thesis that was about professional needleworkers in North Carolina and Virginia as well. So that kind of led me into samplers, and it's not like a big step from samplers to clothing. And you know, I think both of us are particularly interested in women's history as well, which tends to tie in with clothing and quilts and samplers and all the flat textiles as well.
Let's see. With that last garment from the 1800s, what undergarments will be required?
Multiple undergarments would have been required. So by that time, you probably would have had some sort of type of drawers. They probably would have still been open crotch drawers, and you would have had like a chemise or a little undergarment, and then your corset would have gone over top of that. For that look, you could tell very sort of not necessarily cinched corseted, but a very tight corset that's making that tight look that you can then. The reason you need to get a good seamstress and that you're willing to travel to other places for that is you could see how tightly that was sewn over the corset so that it gave that nice smooth look, especially down the front and the back. You would have worn a very long corset to help give that smooth look. And then several layers of petticoats. That one didn't necessarily have a bustle, might have had a little bit of padding. In the years before and after that dress, you would have had a separate bustle. Wire or stiff fabric that would have lifted up to give that sort of shelf look on the back as well. And then, you know, this is before we have deodorant and things, so you want to make sure you're wearing some cotton undergarments that you're sweating into. Fun fact, a lot of our pieces like that in the collection do have a lot of deterioration in the underarms because there's only so much you could do by wearing those undergarments. But at the time, you would have worn multiple layers of undergarments so that your body oils and your sweat was going into them and not your fancy dress fabrics. And it's only years later when they get to us that they have the massive deterioration issues.
How do you spell the name of the Cincinnati seamstress?
Dunleavy was Dunlevy, I believe, but I will double check that. That's what I have, yes. Dunlevy.
And then is there a spool quilt in the museum's collection? And I don't believe so. I'm trying to, we have about 400 quilts in our collection, so I'm trying to run through them all in my mind, but I don't believe we have a spool quilt in our collection. Are there catalogs or other books that have been published about your collection? We do have a quilt catalog that came out with our exhibit, Quilt Speak, Uncovering Women's Voices Through Quilts. That's available in our museum gift shop and online through the gift shop. So if you're interested in that, check out our gift shop online or stop by at the museum.
And Diana did curate that exhibit and write that wonderful catalog.
It was a lot of fun. Is there a collection of samplers at the museum?
We do have samplers at the museum. We don't have, I'm trying to think if any of them are on display because they are so delicate. They are not often on display. We have a few areas where they may rotate in and out occasionally, but you are able to search for them in our collection software and see them.
And when can we expect a new exhibition with the costume textile collection?
We don't have a current costume textile exhibit on the list, but we are working, both Diana and I are working on an exhibit that will be called North Carolina A to Z, which is going to be a lot of fun. And that is going to have a few textile items and costumes scattered in it. The content is going to be tied to us coming up with themes and ideas that are tied to each letter of the alphabet related to North Carolina. So there will be some textile items and clothing in that exhibit, which is going to be in the spring of 22.
So definitely come see that. It'll have a little something for everyone. I believe that is our last question. So thank you all for joining us today, and definitely come see us at the museum and check us out on social media. Thank you all.
Thank you.